will be given unto you. And what was the Lord's reply? Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. That's it. That's the key. And part of being intimate with the Father is that number 2, under point number 8, or letter A. Jesus longed to communicate with God about all things. This is what prayer is about, communication, right? In verse 35, he left the house and went to a solitary place, and there he prayed. Now let's look at the place selected. Solitary place. Right? Also in Luke 5:16, where he withdrew to lonely places. This is where he prayed. Have you ever thought why? Why? Well, since prayer is the means by which we communicate with God, an intimate time with God is best spent in a secluded place where there are no distractions or disturbances. And it makes sense. Communication is quite hard to accomplish when there is interference or hindrances. You know, the other day, I didn't wake up early enough to pray. So a handyman came over to the house, and I thought to myself, yeah, while he's working, I'm just going to go to that little conversation pit and seek the Lord. And I did. A couple of times he interrupted me. Excuse me, hello, I have a question. This is exactly what I mean. This is why it's always good to go to a private room, just you and God, right? So you can seek Him. So the best place to communicate with God in prayer is at a secluded place where it's just you and God, where you can pour out all your heart, or everything in your heart before Him. Because honestly, that's hard to accomplish if you are in front of people. Because when you pray, sometimes you really, like in Colossians, this guy was wrestling in prayer. He pours everything out before God. And there are times you cry in the presence of God. You can't do that in front of people. That's why it's always good to pray in a secluded place. See, as the Son of Man, Jesus often went to a solitary place where He communed with God, as this verse tells us. Now, of course, as He prayed, the question is, what are the contents of His prayers? What are the contents of Christ's prayer? Have you ever thought what His prayers were about? Because it only says, there He prayed. Okay? Well, we could dig deep in this passage, right? Well, this particular instance doesn't give us specifics. Other passages tells us what comprises His prayer. In fact, 18 times the Lord's own prayers are spoken of in the Gospels, bringing out the following facts, representing them. And all of us are all aware of the prayer He taught His disciples right in Matthew chapter 6. You know, this is known as the Lord's Prayer. It's actually meant for His disciples. Right? A prayer that they're supposed to pattern their prayers to. The actual prayer of Jesus Christ is actually in John chapter 17. That is the Lord's Prayer, the one in John 17. But since Jesus taught His disciples how to pray in Matthew 6, then we know that some of the things He mentioned in that prayer were part of His prayer life. With the exception of confessing His sin, because He didn't have to confess any sin because He is a perfect man. Right? So let's look into that. First, we know that Jesus glorified the Father in His prayers. How do we know that? Because in Matthew 6:9 He said, hallowed be your name. Right? Now you can compare that with Matthew 11:25, where He says, at that time Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth. So every time He seeks God, He prays Him first. He praises God first. Also in John 17:1, after Jesus said this, He looked toward heaven and prayed, Father, the time has come, glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. See, the fact that Jesus Christ is asking for that glory is because He's one with God. He deserves the same glory as the Father. But He often started His prayers with adoration and worship, as this is the proper way when approaching the throne of God. When you approach the throne of God, you don't come to God and say, Lord, I want this, I want that. No, you don't. You come to God with reverence. You honor Him. You give Him praise. You worship Him. So based on the passages that we read in the New Testament, we know that Jesus praised and glorified the Father in His prayer in this passage in verse 35. And next we know that Jesus gave thanks to the Father as well. He gave thanks to the Father in his prayers. In John 11:41, he said, Father, I thank you because you heard me. So obviously every time he seeks God, he gives him thanks. Thanksgiving was part of his prayer. As the Father's servant, Jesus showed gratitude to God for everything. Showed gratitude to God as a servant of the Lord. It says in this passage, you see it. Therefore, we can safely assume that here in verse 35, he gave thanks to the Lord, mostly with the accomplishments he had the previous day. He did a lot of ministry. People were cured. The demon-possessed were delivered. The gospel was preached. Therefore, he thanked the Lord for the power and the strength that the Spirit of God provided for him as a man. So we can say that. And next, Jesus also submitted to the Father's will in all his prayers. We see that in Matthew 6:10 when he taught his disciples how to pray, let your will be done. Let your will be done. If you compare that with Luke 22:42, he said, Father, if you're willing, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but your will be done. So it is certain that Jesus, the servant of God, sought the will of the Father with regards to his ministerial works. He did not operate on his own. Never. And we will see this in his movements where he was led and guided by the Spirit of God all the time. So he submitted to the Father. And lastly, most important of all, part of his prayer was Jesus made intercessions for the lost. He made intercessions for the lost, pleading to the Father for their salvation. Look at John 17:20. Jesus said, my prayer is not for them alone. I prayed also for those who will believe in me through their message. He prayed for those people who will believe in him. Remember, he just finished ministering to a crowd of people the previous day. And it's about to have another outreach that day, right? There is no doubt that he was praying for lost sheep to be brought back into the pen. Because in Luke chapter 19, verse 10, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost. So this is the heart of Christ. This is the heart of Christ. Not only Jesus desired God's presence by being with him, but also longed to bring all his petitions before him. So he wanted to be with God, and at the same time, to bring all his petitions before God. Now, the other thing you can observe and learn from the prayer life of Jesus, letter B, is dependency on the Father. He relied on God in all things. See, one would think Jesus would need not to pray anymore because he is God. Right? Well, that is true. Let us not forget, as I said earlier, that he is a man. And as a man, he needed to depend from his Father. Therefore, the need to stay in God's presence through prayer. And mind you, not too long ago, we just saw Jesus coming out of the wilderness, where he spent 40 days and 40 nights fasting and praying. But here we see him again seeking God in prayer. See, we can assume that praying for 40 days and 40 nights would keep Jesus' tank full. Right? But this passage tells us that he needed to be in God's presence continuously for him to be effective in his service for God. Wow. Jesus always depended on the Spirit of God. He preached the Word of God effectively under the anointing of the Holy Spirit. He performed miracles and cast out demons through the power of the Holy Spirit. He was zealous for the works of the Lord because of the Holy Spirit. The only way for him to be filled with the Spirit of God is for him to always stay in the presence of God. That's it. And in this passage, you had a major work ahead of him. Therefore, the need to be in God's presence for him to powerfully and successfully do his ministry. Here's the thing. Some of us, or most of us here, serves the Lord, right? If this was the case with Jesus, the Son of God, what more with us? What more with us? How can we perform our God-given task if our spiritual tank is empty? We can't. You know, great men of God in the past were successful because of their prayer life. John Wesley rose at 4 a.m. each day and spent 2 hours a day in prayer. And look how effective his ministry was. Think about that. 2 hours a day. Martin Luther said, I have so much to do today. Therefore, I will have to spend the first 3 hours in prayer, or the devil will get the victory. Adoniram Judson, disciplined to withdraw by himself to pray 7 times a day. Sounds familiar? That's exactly what Jesus did. He withdrew himself from the crowd to pray. So this guy, Adoniram Judson, he withdrew by himself to pray 7 times. John Welsh also